Well, we're going to look tonight in the book of Esther, all right? So I'm going to invite you to turn there with me to the book of Esther. And if you would go to Esther chapter 4 and verse number 13. Esther chapter 4 and verse number 13. In Esther chapter 4 and verse number 13, the Bible says, "Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall there enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" And so we have the book of Esther. Esther is one of two books named after a woman in the Old Testament, Ruth and Esther. And there are many similarities with the book of Esther and the book of Nehemiah as far as the fact that there are Jewish people serving in the court of the king, Nehemiah as a governor, Esther as a queen. And the events of Esther predate these events of the remnant returning and the prophecies of Micah. And during these times of the return, while the Persian king rules, Esther becomes the queen. And God uses her in an amazing way to deliver his people. God's name is not mentioned in the book of Esther. There are no references to the Lord, but God's hand is at work, and God's presence is there throughout the entire book. The penman of the book of Esther may very well have been Mordecai. That's what tradition tells us. Perhaps could have been Ezra or even Nehemiah. The occasion of the book was during the Persian period of world history after the Babylonian Empire. The Persians overthrew the Babylonians, and from that point forward, the Jews began to return from Babylonian captivity. Some remained in the land of captivity, and the Persian king, of course we know the Persian king Cyrus was the first to allow the Jews to return, just as God had prophesied. But as we come to the book of Esther, Ahasuerus is the king, and he ruled from 486 to 465 BC. 486 to 465 BC. The book of Esther then covers a period from 483 to 473 BC. 483 to 473. And this name, Ahasuerus, has a Greek name that you may have heard too, and that name is Xerxes. Xerxes, that's hard to say and hard to spell. Xerxes. Xerxes. This is Ahasuerus. They are one and the same. The message or the theme of the book of Esther is the sovereignty of God. God is sovereign and God is always at work. And that ought to comfort us as God's people, to know that the Lord is present and that He's always at work in our lives. He's at work in the political affairs and the economic affairs of mankind. The Lord is on the throne, and God is present, and God is active. I want to give you an outline of the book, and there are there are three main points in the book, and there are two subpoints under point number 1. I'm giving you this so you'll know about how many lines you need, okay? And then there are 5 under point number 2, and there are 4 subpoints under point number 3, okay? So you'll need a little space to write the outline. Number 1, here it is: Esther replaces Vashti. Esther replaces Vashti. How do you spell Vashti? V-A-S-H-T-I, Vashti. So what happens is the king Ahasuerus is introduced to us in chapter number 1. And Ahasuerus is a powerful king. He's a very wealthy king. And he decides that he's going to have a party to show off his wealth and to celebrate his accomplishments. And we can read about this in chapter 1 if you have your Bible there. In chapter number 1, Ahasuerus has gathered all the important people together for a royal feast, and this feast has gone on for days, and there's a great celebration of the king's accomplishments. And the queen also, Vashti, had made a feast for the women in the royal house. And so the Bible tells us in chapter 1 and verse 10, on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, Carcass. I mean, what a group of names these guys have, right? They're the 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king. So he commanded these men, verse 11, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. So the king is celebrating, and he wants everybody to know how powerful he is, the realm of his reign. He's showing off his wealth and his riches, and now he wants to show off his wife. And she refuses in verse number 12, but the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. So she said, I am not going to parade in front of your servants, and I am going to keep myself covered. He wanted to show her off. He was drunk. They were involved in all forms of riotousness and revelry. And so he gets an idea to let everybody see his queen, which was against decorum for the day. And she refuses, and then he gets angry. Look at verse 12. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him. So the king gets mad. And then the king consults with his advisors, and they say, you can't let her continue to be your wife. You got to find a new wife, and you got to make a law about this, because if you don't, other wives are going to rebel against their husbands. And so the king and his group, well, they make a law. And what we learn about the king is that he takes some pretty bad advice all throughout this book, until finally he gets the right advice. Now go to chapter 2 and verse number 1. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. So when the party was over, when the revelry had ended, when the influence of the alcohol had dissipated, when the hot temper had settled down, then the king remembered Vashti, and he was filled with regret. So there's a lesson here for us, is there not? Our temper gets us into trouble. Our temper gets us into trouble. And the king had a temper. And because of his temper and because of his lack of judgment, because of his alcohol, many lessons here, he decides we're going to replace the queen. So letter A under Esther replaces Vashti is Vashti's insubordination. That's probably not the best word, but that's the word used in the outline that I'm providing for you tonight. And Vashti's insubordination. Her refusal to do what the king said. And then letter B is Esther's coronation. So what happens? Well, in chapter 2, the king's advisors say, you got to find a new queen. Let's bring in all of the beautiful virgins in the kingdom, and then you can pick which one is your wife. And Esther is the one who is selected. Now, we find out that Esther is the niece of Mordecai. Mordecai serves in the palace, and Mordecai is a Jew. So he's one of the Jews that have remained in Persia. And he has raised his niece. Her parents were killed. He has raised her. She's become a beautiful young woman. She's among those who were taken as a part of this group. And the king selects her to be the queen. Now, Mordecai had told Esther, don't tell anybody that you're a Jew. Don't tell them that you're a Jew. And she did not tell them that she was a Jew. So she is selected, okay? And that's chapter 2, verses 1 through 18. So point number 1, Esther replaces Vashti. Point number 2, Mordecai overcomes Haman. Mordecai overcomes Haman. Now, in chapter 2 and verse number 19, we read at the close of that chapter, after Esther is selected to be the queen, we read that Mordecai discovers a plot to kill the king. Okay? I mean, this is like made-for-TV stuff, right? His niece is now the queen, but he discovers a plot. And in verse 21, in those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlain, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth. They were angry. They sought to lay hand on the king, Ahasuerus, and the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen. And Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And when inquisition or an investigation was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. So Mordecai discovers this plot to kill the king. He reveals that plan to Esther. Esther tells the king, my uncle Mordecai, he discovered this plan. I don't know if she used the term uncle, but Mordecai told me about this plan. You need to investigate these two guys. They're investigated. They're found guilty. They're trying to kill the king, and they're both hanged. All these events are connected, and they're important. So now we come to chapter number 3, and we come to, well, let me give you letter A under point number 2. Mordecai overcomes Haman, and that's Mordecai's loyalty, and that's what we see here. I just gave you the record of that event. Mordecai's loyalty. And then letter B, Haman's promotion and decree. Haman's promotion and decree. So let's go to chapter 3 and verse number 1. After these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him, and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. So now we meet this guy Haman. And what do we know about him? What does the Bible tell us about him? He is an Agagite, okay? How many of you remember the name Agag? All right, Agag was the king of the Amalekites. And the Lord told Saul to utterly destroy the Amalekites. And Saul did not obey. and he took Agag as captive. And so when Samuel showed up, Saul went out to see him and said, "Blessed be thou of the Lord. We've been obedient to the Lord." And they had taken the sheep and the best of the what the Amalekites had, which was a cursed thing, and God said, "Kill everything." And they didn't do that. They chose to keep the best. They decided for themselves that they knew better than God. And we always get ourselves into trouble, don't we? When we decide we know better than God. And so Agag was taken captive, and he came before Samuel the prophet. And he said, "Surely the bitterness of death is past. You're not going to kill me now. I mean, then there's enough bloodshed." And then Samuel took Saul's sword and he slew Agag. Now, all through the Old Testament, we find the consequences of Israel's disobedience in the matter of the Amalekites. We find the Amalekites raising their head again. Now, God had said, in case you're wondering, in Exodus 17, "I will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." The Amalekites were the group that attacked Israel right after they came out of the land. And God said, "These people are under my judgment. I will have war with them from generation to generation." So when God told Saul to utterly destroy them, he meant for him to utterly destroy them, to bring judgment upon them. And Saul, through his disobedience, caused generations to come great problems. In fact, when Saul died, do you remember who came to David to report the news? An Amalekite. An Amalekite said, "Let me tell you," and he brought the crown of Saul to David, trying to curry favor with David. And then he said, "I killed the king because he was wounded and he asked me to kill him." And that was a lie. The king fell on his own sword, and then his armor bearer fell on his sword. But the Amalekite said, "I did it." And so David had the Amalekite put to death because of his own words, his own testimony. So there are consequences for us when we don't obey God. Consequences. So here's an Agagite. Now, it may be that he is called this because he's a hater of the Jews. But we certainly believe that he is a descendant of the Amalekites and perhaps an Agagite in blood. All right? Now, here he is. He is serving in the court of the king. And look at verse 2. "And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman." So Haman had some authority. "For the king had so commanded concerning him, but Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. Then the king's servants, which were in the king's gate, said unto Mordecai, Why transgressest thou the king's commandment? Now it came to pass when they spake daily unto him, and he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew." So the thing that Mordecai really didn't want known and revealed is revealed. He must have told these guys, "Hey, look, I'm not going to bow down to him. I'm a Jew. I only bow down to God." And they made a matter out of that and told Haman, and Haman gets really angry and upset, and Haman wants to conspire to have the Jews killed. So he goes to the king, and he deceives the king into issuing a decree to basically extinguish the Jewish race. All right? So letter B is Haman's promotion and decree. Letter C then is Esther's intervention, chapter 4, verse 1. Chapter 4, verse 1 through chapter 5 and verse 14. So the decree is given by the king, and it's delivered throughout all the kingdom, that on a certain day, all the Jews in the kingdom are going to be killed. That's the decree. And so Mordecai hears the decree. Esther wonders as she hears the response. The Jews go into mourning, and she wants to know what's going on. Mordecai sends word to her, and we read chapter 4, verses 13 and 14. Mordecai says to her, "You're the queen. You've got to go, and you've got to talk to the king, and you've got to tell him what's going on. And who knows whether or not you've come into the kingdom for such a time as this." In other words, all these things have happened so that you can be used of God to speak to the king and to deliver the Jewish race. So let's track back then. What happened? The king and his party and his pride, right? And then his desire to show off, and his wife's refusal to be a part of that, his temper and his rage and his drunkenness, his regret, but the decision's already been made. You can't backtrack. And we're going to find he makes more decisions, and then obviously this one where he falls for the deceitful plan of Haman, and he ushers a decree, and once that decree's been made, you can't reverse it. And so a queen comes in, all right? There's a plan by Haman. He wants to kill all the Jews, but God is one step ahead of him, isn't he? He's far more than one step ahead of him. And what do we know? We know that God is always many steps ahead. So we can watch the news, and we can watch the political campaigns, and we can see all this happening and transpiring in the landscape of the secular affairs of man. And we can get really concerned about it. And then we can read the book of Esther, and we see that it's all under God's control. Kings are going to rage. The haters of God and His people are going to scheme and manipulate and devise plans and build their gallows, but God always has His people, and God is always at work because God is sovereign. That ought to help us sleep at night, shouldn't it? God is in control, and He's working His purposes. The Bible tells us that God, He uses the wrath of man to praise Him. Well, there's an angry king, and there's an angry servant, an Agagite, named Haman. And God will use their wrath to glorify Him, and He will accomplish His purpose through their wrath. So we have Haman's promotion and decree. We have Esther's intervention. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 5:14. What does Esther do? She decides to go to the king and invite the king and Haman to a dinner, to a banquet. Now, she's got to be careful because you can't go to the king. If you go to the king without being summoned to go to the king, then if the king's not in a good mood that day, that could be the end of your life. The king granted her the scepter. That was his approval. And she risked her life in going into the king. That sounds strange, right? But that's exactly what happened. And that's why she said to Mordecai, "If I perish, I perish. But I'm going to go into the king and talk to him." So she goes to the king. The king grants her the scepter. And she says, the king says, "Well, tell me what's your request? Why are you here? What do you need?" And she says, "I want you to come to a banquet, you and Haman." And so the king says, "All right, we'll come to the banquet." In the meantime, Haman is foaming and fuming, and he wants to kill Mordecai. And he tells his wife, and she has an idea. Her idea is build a gallows and then hang him publicly. And then you'll have your revenge on him. And he says, "That's a great idea. I think I'll do that." And so he starts building the gallows. Well, they go to the dinner the first night, and they have the meal, and the king says, okay, Esther, tell me, what is it that you request? And I find this interesting. She asks him to come back the next day. Now, I think if I were there, and I knew what was going on, and I knew what was at stake, I would have said, what are you doing? I mean, this man, Haman, is trying to have you killed and all of your people. And you have an opportunity to tell the king what's going on, and you didn't do it. Do you think that's strange? I think it's strange. What do we learn here? We learn that the Lord is in the delays. We learned that the Lord is in the delays. I don't know what happened. All I can tell you is that God stopped her from saying what she needed to say that night, and she said, come back again tomorrow. Now, in chapter 6, will you turn there with me? In chapter 6, that same night, the king can't sleep. He just can't get to sleep. He's tossing and turning, and he turned the light on, and he said, forget it. And he commanded his servants to bring the record of the Chronicles, chapter 6 and verse 1. He said, hey, fellas, read me some of the Chronicles. So one guy said, okay, king, I'll read something. And he starts looking through the Chronicles. And he says, ooh, this is pretty good. I'll read this to you, king. There were 2 of your chamberlains who wanted to murder you. Oh, I remember those guys. Yeah, they were going to kill you. And then the queen came and told you about it, and you conducted an investigation, and we found out that they were really trying to kill you, and we had them put to death. And the king said, yes, I remember that. Man alive. They got close. And the king said, who was it that exposed them? Well, let me read that, king. Oh, it was Mordecai. Oh, yeah. I know Mordecai. I got to do something for that guy. Did we ever do anything for him? No, king, we didn't do anything for him. Well, we got to do something for him. And so Haman comes in the next day, and the king says, well, tell me what I should do to honor the man that the king delights in. And Haman thought he was talking about him, right? So Haman gives all this out, have a parade for him and all this jazz. And then after he gets through talking about what he should do, put the king's robe right on the horse and lead him through. And here's the man the king delights in. And Haman's thinking, it's me, right? And then the king says, okay, Haman, that's a great idea. Go find Mordecai and you be the guy that leads him through town. Well, that was the worst thing Haman could have ever heard, right? And so he does that in chapter 6, verses 14 through chapter 7 and verse 10. And when he gets back home, he tells his wife, because she's saying, what in the world's wrong with you now? And he tells her what happens. And she says, this isn't good. This isn't good. And it wasn't. All right? So we have Mordecai. He overcomes Haman. And then Haman falls. They go back to the banquet. This is night number 2. Now remember, God's in the delays, right? God's in the delays because now the king knows about what Mordecai did to save him. And so he goes back for the meal, and the queen says, okay, when he asks her, what's up? Tell me what's going on. What is it that you need? She says, well, one of your servants has issued a decree against me and my people to have all of us killed. And it's Haman. And the king leaves the room in a fit, and then Haman is begging Esther to speak for him and to spare him. And then the king comes back in and he thinks that Haman is trying to force himself upon the queen, and everything just really spirals out of control and everything falls apart for Haman. And then he's hung upon the gallows that he built. And so Haman's done. Again, what do we learn here? We learn that the enemies of God will never profit in their plans and schemes to defeat God's purposes and destroy God's people. And though it seems that they have all the power, all the resources to make everything they desire to come to pass, they cannot go further than what God will allow them to go. And God can put them, He can stop them, He can bring them to an end in a moment, and their plans unravel. Have you noticed something about this secular, godless government that we've had in recent years? They're very incapable. And that's a good thing. They're very incapable. They cannot seem, to get out of their own way, can they? There's a God in heaven. And He will accomplish His purposes. He will preserve His people. Let me give you point number three. We still got a problem now, okay? Haman is dead, but the king's decree has still been issued, and there's a date looming when the enemies of the Jews have a license to put them to death. All right? So number three, Israel survives Haman's evil plan. Haman is gone, but the plan still exists. This is chapter 8, verse 1 through the end of the book. Letter A is Esther and Mordecai's advocacy. Esther and Mordecai's advocacy. What do? They go to the king and they become advocates for the Jews. King, we got to do something. All the people are going to die if you don't do something. So the king could not reverse the command. So here's what the king did. The king offered a new decree that gave the Jews license to destroy their enemies. And he gave them that license before the decree was to come into effect, the decree of their death. So I imagine that they were able to organize, which they probably wouldn't have been able to do before, and have some form of defense or weapons so that they could round up the people that wanted them dead and put them to death. He gave them a right to defend themselves. And so they did that, and they overthrew their enemies, and they won a victory. And therefore they had a feast called the Feast of Purim, Purim, which is celebrated by Jews today. The Feast of Purim. And it's a celebration of God's faithfulness. A celebration of God's faithfulness. And God's power to preserve and keep His people. And then letter D, you have Mordecai's fame. How that God advanced Mordecai and gave him a very prominent position in the kingdom. Let me give you some key words. Just one, perish. That word's used 5 times. And I think about Paul's words. He said, I do not count my life dear unto myself. Neither count I my life dear unto myself. My glasses keep fogging up. Does anybody else have that problem? Neither count I my life dear unto myself. In other words, I'm willing to submit my life to accomplish God's purpose and plan. And that's what Esther was doing with her life. If I perish, I perish. but I'm going to be obedient to the Lord. Just give you some devotional thoughts. This is the only book in the Bible that does not mention the name or the names of God. But God is seen, though He is unseen. What do we see? We see the unseen hand of God. The unseen hand of God. He's at work, right? He's at work in the affairs of men. He's at work in the administration of a kingdom that does not know Him. And He's at work in that kingdom to bring His purposes to pass. Are you comforted by that tonight? I am. So what do we learn from that? We learn that God is always working even when we can't see Him. God is always working even when we cannot see Him. Many of you are trusting God to do things. You're praying and asking God to do things, and it doesn't seem as if anything is happening. God is at work. God is at work. Someone has said, even when you cannot track Him or trace Him, you can trust Him. And we're going to learn that lesson in the book of Job, right? Because Job is saying, if God would come down here and explain this to me, it would really help me right now. And if all my friends who are trying to explain my suffering would just be quiet and God would just talk to me and explain this to me, it would really help me. You see, we learn that we have to trust God. Now, God has come down and spoken to us, hasn't He? The answer is yes. So, how do we hear His voice? Well, we get in His Word. We enter into prayer and communion with Him. So, when you can't track Him or trace Him, you can trust Him. Another thing that we realize here is that God cared for the remnant of those Jews who were carried away into Babylon. Remember the prophecy of Jeremiah? He said, look, you're going to be captives. Accept that and trust God. Go to Babylon, build houses there, pray for the peace of the place. God is going to take care of you. And what do we get from that? We get a lot of comfort, right? Because when things aren't going the way we hope they'll go, when it seems like all is lost, God is still good and God is in control. And really, then what you have in the book of Esther is a living Old Testament example of Romans 8:28. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to His purpose. And here is an Old Testament illustration of Romans 8:28. So what do we know about the Lord? He's in the details, right? He was in the details. The king is going to lose his temper and get rid of his wife, but God's got a new wife. And what's He going to do with that new wife? He's going to use her to deliver the people. Haman is this man who hates the Jews and he wants them all dead. And God's going to defeat His purposes and His plans. He's going to keep the king awake one night, and he's going to have the chronicler read the story of how that Mordecai devised or revealed the plan. And that's what saved the king and caused the king to be sympathetic toward the Jews even more. And then when he finds out his wife is a Jew and her uncle is Mordecai, well, then he's resolved. God puts all this together, and God's putting things together for us so we can trust the Lord. Amen?